Hi all, and welcome to the Medical AI Lab session. I'm delighted that today we have Morgan Sanchez talking to us about back to basics version control. Without further ado, take it away, Morgan.
So thanks so much. Let me share my screen. All right, I'm assuming everyone can see my screen. Awesome. All right, hey everyone, I'm Morgan Sanchez. I am a big PhD student at Harvard Medical School, studying bioinformatics and integrative genomics. And today I'm going to be talking about back to basics, version control, tools, and best practices for collaborative coding. And I just want to give a huge shout out to Joe Downs at the Johns Hopkins University Applied Physics Lab, because all of these slides are actually adopted from a presentation that I got back in 2018 as part of my intern training in the circuit program. So just to provide a little bit of an overview for what we're going to talk about today. First, we're going to talk about why we want to use version control. Then we're going to go into some examples of different types of version control. And then we're going to talk more about Git, which is a version control system, the interfaces that you can use Git with, Git as a graphical model, some example workflows, some basic commands, some do's and don'ts when you're using Git, and just a little bit of a conclusion. And I just want to preface that again, most of these jokes are all courtesy of Joe, who's just a really funny human. So why do we use version control? Well, let's say we have a masterpiece. Our code is beautiful and, it's like the Mona Lisa. It's perfect. And we don't think we need to add any more features. It's working. It's awesome. So we save it. We save our current version and we're happy. But then, we start talking to some friends and someone suggests, maybe we should add something to Mona Lisa. Like maybe we can make her better. Maybe there's another feature that we can include. So we decide to add sunglasses and a mustache. And we think we're really happy about it. But then we talk to our PI and he was not very happy with this current version of the code. This is not a version that we want to continue to allow to contaminate our project. But the good thing is we're smart and we use version control and we can always go back to a previous version. So that's exactly why we want to use version control, because we want to be able to save different versions along the way, try out new features, and not be afraid to experiment with things and break things. So some examples of version control are, number one, the simplest version, having multiple versions of the same file, using naming conventions to tell us where we are in our development. Here's an example. You have your awesome file, and then you name it awesome final when you think you're done, and then after that you name it awesome final, and at some point you have like 52 finals at the end of your file. And I'm definitely guilty of doing things like this. But this obviously can work in small instances, but it's definitely not the best way to do things. Then we have systems that sort of handle all of the version control for you, automatically saving versions of your files, such as Google Docs, right? We go online and we make changes and it's automatically saving different versions, but we don't really have control or as much control over, when we save those versions. Jupyter also does stuff like this. But then we move into formal version control systems, which are tools that are specifically created for the purpose of recording changes in a set of files over time and being able to recall specific versions of your code later. And these give you a lot more control over, again, which versions you want to save and how you want to save them. And Git is one example of such a system. So the underlying model you could think of for Git is directed graphs. as a review for many of you probably. It stores the complete history of a project where the nodes are commits and edges are references to parent commits. And essentially what it does is it's efficiently storing these changes because it's storing differences between commits. And this little graphic illustrates what how you might imagine your project looking like in terms of a graph. And then, there are multiple ways to work with Git. The first of which is you could use a single branch. So pretend that we're only looking at this purple one here. And essentially your master branch is where you do all of your work. And you're just like super careful whenever you're pushing to master to not break anything. This workflow requires less knowledge and might be sufficient for a small project that you're working on individually. But I think probably the better way to look at things, the better workflow to use is using feature branches. It's a little bit more complicated, but essentially you start a new branch, kind of like you see in this diagram, for each large change that you plan to make. And you keep, one version that's like your working version that you always make sure is fully functional. And when you have a new feature that you're happy with, you can merge that branch into master after you submit it for review. And the good things about this is, it's safe to push to your remote repository. It's you can have your own branch and you're able to experiment with things and break things, which can be great. So when you're using Git, you can use the command line interface. You can use a graphical user interface. There's actually a GitHub app, in addition to some functionality on the website, which I don't always recommend using. But then you can also integrate Git into your favorite IDE. I like to use VS Code, and it's worked pretty well for me there. Some basic commands to make sure that you're familiar with Git, and again, this might be a lot of review, but always good to go over. For making a local Git repository, if you have an existing folder that you've already started, you can initialize that folder as a Git repository using git init. And then what's really great is we have websites like GitHub where people put all of their code bases, and you can always clone someone's repository and either use it or continue to work on it. And then there are a number of commands for checking on the progress of what you're doing. So there's git status, which allows you to see sort of the status of your workspace, which files are added, which files have been changed. Git diff can tell you some information about a number of things, but one of them is the differences between two files. And then git log can give you sort of a log of the different commits that you have made. And then some of the most important ones are pull, add, commit, and push. And I'll talk a little bit about this later, but I suggest adding specific file names and committing with a message that tells you exactly what that commit is. And then this graphic is really, really nice. It just kind of gives you an illustration of what's going on under the hood, right? You have your remote repository, which might exist on GitHub, and then you have a local repository in a workspace. The other two, we don't necessarily need to get into too much, but essentially you are working on your files and you can commit them to your local repository and push them up to the remote version so that your friends or teammates can see them and pull those changes down to their workspace. And now I'll just go into a few do's and don'ts when using Git. I think a lot of these people might think are fairly obvious, but I always think it's a good idea to review them. So do memorize, pull, add, commit, push. Always make sure that you're fetching the most recent version of the repository so that your teammates are, so that you're using the most recent version, and make sure that you're pushing any changes that you make so that everyone, again, has the most up-to-date version. Commit often with informative messages. This, sometimes you might not, if you're doing it, not very often, you might run the risk of committing very large uninformative commits and changing a whole bunch of files, and no one really knows exactly what that change was. Do add specific files and work one feature at a time, and do create separate branches and pull requests for large changes. And then moving on to the don'ts, which are kind of related to the do's in some ways, but don't add large or unnecessary files to a Git repository. There are tools out there that can handle large files, but for GitHub, for example, you shouldn't be adding data logs and notebook checkpoints, for example, because like we mentioned before, Git is really awesome in that it stores any changes between commits. But for example, if you're adding data files that you're generating randomly every time you run an experiment, and the file changes because your train and test split are different each time, that's not really an informative change to capture. And I personally have made the mistake of adding very large files to Git and needing to make a new repository because it clogged everything up. So definitely watch out for that. I always suggest adding files individually, so never using Git at all. And the way that I think about that is if it's too difficult for you to add individual files, then you're probably adding too many files to that commit. Your commit is probably not focusing on one specific issue. And it's going to be hard for people to keep track of those changes and review those changes and understand what you've actually done. So I always suggest being very careful with the number of files that you add. It's always good also, in case you do use Git at all or something crazy happens, to include a Git ignore in your repository. And this just basically, if you're not familiar, tells Git which files shouldn't be added to the repo, that it shouldn't track. Another thing that I recommend, and I know everyone loves Jupyter Notebooks, but I'd recommend don't overuse Jupyter Notebooks. I love Jupyter, but sometimes version control can get pretty confusing when you're using Jupyter Notebooks. And I think there's a time and place for them, right? I think Jupyter is really great for interactive demos that are super user-friendly. And you can write a notebook once and put it on your repo as a demo. And something that I suggest doing is moving anything that can be moved to Python scripts to a script that's separate from the notebook. So for example, any functions or classes that you might normally define in your notebook, move them into a separate file so that those changes can easily be tracked and you can easily like swap out different functions for things. And then of course you can still have your demo notebook there, as long as people aren't running the notebook and then adding it and committing those changes all the time, sort of clogging up your repo in the same way that logs and data can clog up your repo. The last don't is, it goes along with a lot of the do's. Don't go long periods of time without committing and pushing to promote. If you're working individually, this is also important. I could imagine an instance where, I don't know, you're biking next to the Charles and your laptop flies out of your backpack and lands into the river, right? This is obviously that exact situation isn't going to happen to you, but it's the same reason you want to back up files. You want to have another backup so that you don't lose all of your work. And then working collaboratively, committing often means that your teammates have access to what you're doing. They understand the progress that your team is making, and they can give you feedback on the things that you write, and they can use them for themselves to run their own experiments. So it's really important to be keeping up with your repository. In conclusion, version control is really important. It provides organizational structure and prevents the loss of work. It enables you to experiment and collaborate when it's used correctly. And if you're not using version control, which I hope everyone is, you should be. And you should, take into consideration some of these do's and don'ts when you're using version control. The last thing that I'll add is something that you should do is ask questions. Ask someone if you need help, because with all of this control that you have over saving your versions, sometimes things can happen and you can end up doing something really scary. You stash all of your work, you don't know how to get it back or something like that. Just don't be afraid to ask your teammates for help or Stack Overflow, because with great power, right, comes great responsibility. You should be aware that it's a very powerful tool when used correctly, and you shouldn't be afraid to ask if you need help. So that's all I have. Very short presentation, just back to basics. And yeah, that's it. Thank you.
Thanks, Morgan. That was very useful. Thank you.